Welcome to the Healthy Anger Toolbox. I'm Marty Wollner. Today, my guest is Karen McMahon from Journey Beyond Divorce.
And it's often in the post-divorce, not always, but often, where we'll have somebody who comes to us who's many years post-divorce and just stuck in so much anger because of betrayal, because they thought the marriage was fine, because it wasn't the plan that they had, because after 30 years they shouldn't be where they are, whatever, and just incredibly stuck in that anger. And what I find is that anger is such an important and vital emotion for us. And yet, as with anything, whether it's denial or depression or anger, if we're stuck in it, it no longer serves us. Its job is done and we're still holding on. And so what comes up for me is that you've gotten stuck in the grieving process.
So there's a loss. The grieving process is due to a loss, and realizing that there is an emotional process. And if we get stuck somewhere in that process, that can bring up that anger emotion.
Well, we can get stuck in the anger. So one of the phases, and it's not linear, grieving isn't linear. So we've got denial and depression and anger and bargaining and acceptance are like the five that most people know about. And grief is kind of like a pinball machine, right? For those who are old enough to know what a pinball machine is. And so you're bouncing all around. There's no going from point A to point B because you're just all over the place, which is normal and healthy. But when someone gets stuck in any one of them, so if you're stuck in denial, it doesn't serve you. If you're stuck in anger, then and you can't get out of it, then what's happened is you've gotten locked in the process. And so you haven't fully grieved. And so you can't touch acceptance and then live into acceptance and move forward. And your audience probably has such a wide range of issues that they're angry about. For divorce, you could be angry because your spouse cheated on you. You could be angry because you invested a couple of decades, raised children, and now just when you should be enjoying the best part of your life, it's fallen apart. You could be angry because he or she promised to deal with their addiction or their alcoholism and get healthy, and they just never could. And for a million other reasons. If you're grieving in a healthy way, you get past the denial, and then you get really sad and depressed, and you get angry, and then you're, well, maybe, what if, only if, the whole bargaining thing. And while you bounce around, you touch acceptance. And so I would say to your listeners, whatever it is that you're spitting angry about, what would acceptance look like? And it may be that your first thought is, no freaking way. I'm not accepting whatever that is. And if I could, because we deal with people with a lot of who are in abusive relationships, nobody's suggesting that you accept unacceptable behavior. That's not it. We're inviting you to accept that a person shows up a certain way that's unacceptable. And what our audience gets stuck in is, why does she have to, he shouldn't have, it didn't have to go this way, like all of this resistance. But he is, and she is, and it did. And no matter how angry you are or for how long, whatever is still is. And acceptance is that shift from, is this anger serving me? And we know, and we'll talk about this, anger does serve to a certain point, and then no more. Then it depletes, then it sucks the life out of us, and it pushes people away who we really want to get close.
So I'm hearing you talk about getting stuck in the anger and trying to just appreciate or even consider acceptance. So the tools, so strategies about getting unstuck, because getting stuck and aware of being stuck in the anger is one thing, but what can we do differently in terms of supporting people to get them unstuck and move them just somewhat to consider acceptance.
Yeah, and awareness is really the first step. And so someone might say, I'm aware that I'm angry. I don't need awareness. But that's very surface.
Mm.
Okay, so you're aware that, and whatever that anger is doing to you, so you're aware of that. So let's dig a little deeper. And this is where the tools begin. Um, when something immediately happens, you can have anger before a thought. But when you've been chronically angry, there is a storyline that is running in your head. And so that's the awareness that we're inviting you into right now. What is it? What's my story? What's my story about who did what and whose fault is what, or how I'm the victim of, or um, and not to diminish that whatever your circumstances could be really, really hard. But if you begin to pay attention to that story, therein lies the root of your chronic anger. And so it's baby steps. The first thing is just to notice. And I would say one tip I'll put out there right now is sit down and write your story. Write it, vomit it onto the page, all that you're angry about, all the ways you've been wronged, all the ways he, she, or it was wrong and terrible and bad. Just write it all out and then walk away from it. And when you come back, see if you can find even one thing where there might be a different perspective on it.
Wow. So we can stand in our power in terms of understanding and ownership of the thoughts and the story that we're telling ourselves. And I'm hearing you really in a very profound and powerful way to be able to change that story. Start out with little steps, little ways, different perspectives, reframing situations, perhaps offering compassion or grace or tolerance in certain areas, but really reclaiming our power to change that story.
And I think in our audience, one of the most profound ways, and I have this little saying that so many clients have been like, oh my God, um, when somebody does something that causes us to get angry, that we get angry because of someone's behavior, and certainly when you're dealing with family of origin or people you've known a long time, I'll have clients who will say, I can't believe she went out and ran the credit card up that much. And my first question is, well, you've been married 25 years. Has she ever done it before? All of the time. And so therein lies the story. So it's not that you can't believe it. You actually could expect it. And so until we get over the resistance of, but she shouldn't be that way, she should know better. Okay, well, we've named the problem. The problem is you have a spouse who overspends. Your unwillingness to accept that if she has a credit card, she'll overspend. So now you're angry. Are you angry at her or are you angry at you for not actually creating the boundaries to protect your finances from a behavior that actually you know exists? And I'm using that example, but we could go into verbal abuse. We could go into betrayal. We can go into people with mental health issues. When we begin, and this is the beginning of acceptance, is when we begin to notice that my story doesn't include accepting what I know to be true. I'm just going to keep getting angry about it. Well, go at that, but it doesn't really help very much, does it?
That's powerful. The perception, our perspective of actually what's happening, not the actual happening. It's how we're perceiving and our perspective, and we can actually change that. We have the power to reframe or again move just slight ways of doing it for our benefit, not necessarily letting the other person off the hook, but realizing that we're helping ourselves by changing our anger.
It's not about letting the other person off the hook, but if you married a giraffe, he doesn't show up as a zebra the next day. If you have a sibling who's a certain way and that's the person you're angry at, they've probably been pretty consistent in their behavior. So what we can do, right? Because anger informs, anger is basically saying something, I'm not safe. Something's wrong here. Something's not within the lane of my integrity, my desire. Well, chronic anger just depletes us. But if you can say, okay, I really am angry that I have a sibling who's an addict, who's hurt my parents and, steals and does these things. Okay. What are the boundaries that you can set? If that were the case, getting yourself into a program so that you can learn more about your reaction to it. If there are boundaries with locks and finances, so often people get angry, but they don't accept the other person or the circumstance and then take the steps, the empowering steps, and stay within the lane of what you have power. So typically we get very reactive and very angry when we feel powerless. And the reason we feel powerless is because we're trying to change a person or a circumstance that we have no power to change. And so our entire Journey Beyond Divorce focus for all of our clients is there's one thing you have incredible amounts of control and power over, and that's you. And so always come back there. Come back to your thoughts. How true is that perspective? If the perspective is really true, what am I doing about it? How am I creating whatever protection I need, or detachment that I need, or forgiveness that I need, or mercy? So whatever it is that I need, what can I do to soothe me so that I don't live in anger? Because living in anger is so depleting, and there's so much of a better way. And
And I
we
hear
can,
us. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we can be so peaceful and joyful amidst other people's bad behavior and difficult circumstances.
Wow, I hear the joy. That's something when you just said about being joyful and getting through that. But I wanted to go back also about coming back and reconnecting to standing in our power and just understanding and being aware that we have power and control of our own anger, to own our anger response, our emotional response, the way we're processing anger. And I find, Karen, even sometimes people will hand off their power by blaming and doing some other things when rather standing in their power and owning the anger and their response and their emotional reaction can be, again, it helps them achieve and move forward in terms of growth and development, and being able to change that anger. But when we blame and project and do things like that, we're actually, sometimes I find people can actually be handing away their power and not realizing that by owning what's happening and how they're reacting and perceiving the situation, they can be empowered to help themselves heal.
Yeah. And if you think about it, I mean, I just did something in the last 2 days where my reaction left me feeling bad about myself. I didn't show up as my best self. And when you're acting out of anger, you're definitely not showing up as your best self. And, for those who have a spiritual paradigm, you might ask, would I behave that way if God was watching, Buddha was watching, the universe was watching? Like, there's so many different ways. And then if the answer is, oh gosh, if I was doing what I do out in public, what I did behind closed doors. So right there, we begin to say, okay, so my behavior isn't even in integrity with who I am and how I want to be. And then the excuse is, but he or she or it, and I'm so angry. And it doesn't have to be an either or. They can be difficult, displeasing in whatever way. I can feel my feelings, I can respect my feelings, and I can still choose a behavior, a response that's in integrity with who I want to be. And when you start doing that, you feel good about yourself. I have found that some of the people who've triggered me the most, I consider them like my greatest teachers, because I learned compassion, I learned grace, I learned forgiveness, I learned patience. And it's usually, people pretty close emotionally attached to us, right? Our family of origin, our kids, our parents, who can really trigger us. And that anger, you can use it to fuel a refinement and a healing that allows you to be your best self. You don't have to be stuck in it.
Wow, I appreciate the idea of how we handle our anger being part of our identity. And we have power and control as to who we are and how we present ourselves with anger, and making that decision as to whether we're going to allow our anger to change our identity and change who we want to be and how we want to present ourselves. And I'm hearing you also suggest, Karen, how anger is a signal, an opportunity for growth, for connection. And when we talk about healthy anger, the idea is to use it and understand it's an inevitable emotion, and to understand there are ways of being able to feel better and to be able to be actually closer to people and be able to accept closer to acceptance of situations by being staying in power and control of our own anger.
Yeah. I recently did a podcast episode with a woman named Carla McLaren, which you might be really interested in speaking to. She wrote a book. Our episode is The Genius in All Your Emotions. And she's got a lot of trauma background. And she spent her life researching these difficult emotions, trying to understand they can't be bad. If we have them, they can't be bad. And like anger and fear and panic and anxiety. And she speaks beautifully about how each emotion informs and guides us. And so anger informs and guides us. And she said something so interesting in my interview. She said, but then when it's time for it to go, you don't let it go. So
Mm.
its job is done. Let it go out the front door and head toward peace and joy. But you don't do that. You hold on to the anger. And that's where it becomes unhealthy. And so I think that your message in general, which is anger is a natural, healthy, valuable emotion. But as with everything in balance, right? And so the chronically angry person is fully out of balance.
And I've had some chronically angry clients that I've dealt with. In fact, one in particular described her anger as a Pandora's box, that she feels like she can remain calm until all of a sudden something may trigger her or happen, and this chaos just gets unleashed. And so we talked a lot about how it's pent up, and although she's able to control it in other areas, it becomes explosive at times, and how to actually deal with that. And we talked about actually and really unpacked how anger can be a secondary emotion, that it also may be covering up something primary, some pain, some shame, fear, anxiety, and really to kind of unpeel that a bit to figure out what that primary emotion is. And I find with chronic anger, a lot of times people tend to deal with the behaviors and want to manage the behavior without really getting to the core issue in that primary emotion.
And that's why, for me, chronically angry people are lost in the grieving process, because that's really where we go through this rainbow of emotions because our childhood wasn't what it should have been. Our spouse, betrayed us. Our business that we put X number of years into just like threw us to the curb. Whatever that anger is, there's a whole processing. And I do think in our society, I think that grieving doesn't really get the honor and respect that it needs, and everything is a loss. I mean, our whole lives we experience new excitement and we experience loss. And when we learn to grieve well through the small losses, when something big like divorce comes up, you have a better opportunity to move through all of those different emotions. And I agree with you completely. It's easier to be angry than to be scared, to be anxious, to be so many of the more tender emotions. It's like it's got a little bit of a thicker skin to it, and yet it's not the whole story. And that's why I suggested that writing, because when you write, if you wrote it all down, your hurt's going to be in there, your fear is going to be in there, your disappointment is going to be in there. It's not just going to be anger.
I also find that some people get a bit addicted to the anger, that the anger can be energizing because of the cortisol and the adrenaline release in the brain. that by yelling and screaming and raging and reacting in less than healthy ways, they feel they're getting it out. It's a catharsis. Not realizing that the release of those neurochemicals are actually, when you talk about depletion, exhaustion, and they're really taking the energy, sapping the energy of the body. And just to have that shift sometimes in the paradigm and belief system that, getting the energy out and raging and used to be actually old belief system that we needed to punch pillows and do certain things to get our anger out. When now we can process and rethink anger and do different things sensorily to be able to calm ourselves down without having to do all that raging. But getting that out of control behavior, I find some people feel justified because of the energy of release, because they feel, again, that trapped energy that you mentioned, to be able to get that out is healthy for them without necessarily understanding the less than healthy impact as well.
Well, what's really interesting is I did a series on high conflict divorce. So I was talking to a lot of psychologists and what have you about high conflict personalities. And what I learned is that, and so if you're listening, you may have been raised by one, you may know one, it may be part of your anger, you may be one. And what they said is that chaos is comfortable and calm and quiet is very uncomfortable. And so as you talk about people addicted to anger, an interesting thing is to consider, is calm and quiet and ease uncomfortable for me? Is it so outside my comfort zone, so unfamiliar to me that I keep navigating back to this thing that I kind of know isn't good for me or that I don't want? And we do a lot of work around comfort zone. And what's interesting is I wrote an article, possibility lies on the other side of your comfort zone. So when we meet our edge, and so if a situation comes up and it's just so comfortable to get angry and rage, what would happen if you didn't? What would happen if you pushed through that comfort zone? You bit your tongue. In 12 steps, they say count to 10 if you're angry, count to 100 if you're really angry, right? And we talked about this offline, that whole idea of create space, just create a pause, allow the pain body that Eckhart Tolle talks about to come up. You feel your whole body getting hot, and then allow it to go back down. And what's fascinating is what people stay angry at. And when they create that space and they write their story and they look at their beliefs that they may not even believe, it might just be like a recurring story in their head, they get to see, like, when the pain body resides, how important is it? How angry do I have to get about this? And if it is that important, that's where you go back to your power. Do I need to sever the relationship? Do I need to set stronger boundaries? Do I need to create some other kind of a protection for myself? You're totally in your power. And now whatever it or he or she is, you've buffered yourself without the chaos of the anger and the raging. I used to anger and rage all the time. And someone had once said serenity to me. And I was like, I don't know what that word means. That was many moons ago. And if that's you, if you're so angry that the concept of peace and serenity eludes you, there's an invitation. There's an invitation for you to start, doing some of these practices to get in touch with what's under your cover story and tease it apart, untangle it, so that you can just baby step by baby step begin to break it down.
You talk about the peace and serenity. I talk a lot about joy, helping people experience the joy and getting past the anger. I'll even ask sometimes clients, how do you experience joy? When's the last time you experienced joy? And when they many times have challenges coming up with those moments and realizing that it's a big anger wall that's preventing them from experiencing joy, we work on how to get over, under, around that wall. but just even visualization as to what joy looks like, and
Yes.
really introduction, as you say, your invitation to peace and serenity and calmness and joy. And for some people, that's a long journey. And that introduction and that connection can be a profound one, because I find that when people realize they can experience joy and there is that potential, then they sometimes feel empowered to figure out how to get past the anger, whether it's joy with their children or joy in a situation or whatever, wherever their joy may lie, to be able to help that connection and the realization that a lot of their anger is preventing them from the joy and the calmness and the serenity, and they can stand in their power and control to change that.
It's so interesting as you tell that story. I had a client who, when I invited her into that, she shut down, she clamped down so much. And when we got to what was at the heart of that, she didn't want to open the door to the possibility of joy because she couldn't be disappointed one more time. It was like almost the fear of going there. Like, don't even ask me to look at what's on the sunnier side because life is so hard for so long. I don't even want to get hopeful or encouraged that that's possible because it's just going to slam me down and disappoint me. And that was actually the beginning of us untangling all of that. Like, well, what does that mean? And what is your resistance to considering being joyful, to be considering going out and doing that thing that you would love? Um, and and where could you even take like the slightest baby step? And so for some of you listening, I mean, maybe that's it. It's like you're even afraid, like your anger has become so your norm that there's a fear, right? Because we're all afraid, again, of pushing outside of our comfort zone. And so while you're uncomfortable in your anger, it may be more comfortable because it's so familiar. And I'll just say that, working with people who've been married a couple of years to many, many, many decades, who have to push through their comfort zone, it's one of the most liberating things, because they're self-inflicted walls and ceilings.
Mhm.
And it's like the world is our oyster. And when we put ourselves in a box and say, I can't leave the box because it's dangerous out there, the danger is in the box, not outside of the box.
Thank you, Karen. Journey Beyond Divorce. So tell me about your organization. I know your story. You connect with a lot of people. I looked into some of your workshops, and you have some great survival kits, post-divorce survival kits. So
Yeah.
share some of your experience in terms of your connection with that.
Yeah. So I started Journey Beyond Divorce in 2010. And I had a really hard I had a challenging marriage and a really, really hard divorce that lasted 3.5 years. My kids were barely in grade school when I had to sit them down and tell them that I was leaving. 3.5 years of a couple of visits from the police, child protective services, total financial devastation. It was just brutal. And yet, at some point early on, I decided to keep the focus on myself. And I went into a 12-step Al-Anon program. And it changed my life, because when I emerged 3.5 years later, while I was a little bruised and battered, I was such a better version of myself that I felt more self-love than I think I ever had. I felt more self-esteem and self-confidence. And and I was selling commercial printing. And I remember, as someone who prays, just saying, like, God, there has to be something more important that you have for me than selling ink on paper. And I got into coaching. And right away, I knew that coaching is about helping people through transitions. Divorce is one of the most devastating. I was a child of divorce as well. And so I started Journey Beyond Divorce. And now we've got a team of 5 coaches. We have a podcast that's been up since 2016, Journey Beyond Divorce. And we created a 12-step program for people who want to kind of go at their own pace and don't have a lot to invest, who can just really learn and grow through a painful process. I like to say, use the pain of divorce to fuel your healing and refinement so that you emerge the best version of yourself. And so that's what we do.
Wow. So you used your resiliency from some adversity to really be able to go out and support others. Karen McMahon, thank you. So grateful for joining us today. Such a valuable conversation. And I have to say, I'm going to go back and listen to your podcast because I'm so inspired by some of your talks and connections around triggers. And we'll talk more about that. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for what you do as well.